Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. This is we got another wonderful and fantastic research webinar that we're having here today at the World Trade Center Health Program. We are excited you could all make it. We have a fantastic presentation today by Dr. Yael Cycowicz, and she's going to be starting in just a moment. Our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Christy Anderson, will be presenting her and introducing her in just a moment. I see more people are coming on, so I want to give you just a little bit of a heads up on what we're doing today in case this is your first webinar. We are going to have the presentation in just a few moments. During that presentation, we ask that you remain on mute and just allow our presenter to present all of the information that she has. Then we're going to stop the recording session, and then you'll be free to ask any questions that you like, and Dr. Cycowicz will respond. And then after that, we're going to have a special discussion, and she will lead that as well. So if you don't mind just staying on mute, if you weren't on mute already, and we'll get started with our presentation. Dr. Travis Cabali did let me know that we do not have any major announcements today. Just a couple of updates. Everyone should have received an email about our upcoming in-person research meetings that we're having. There's going to be 2 of them this year. We're excited about that. The first one is going to be July 28th, and that is a Wednesday. Once again, that email has gone out with the announcement, but if you didn't get it before, don't worry, just shoot me an email. We're also going to send another update very soon about the event. There is a second event that is also going to occur on November 7th. And that's another research webinar that we're getting, a research in-person meeting that we're going to have. So we're going back to in-person. We are not stopping the research webinars too, because there's still so much fantastic information to share. And speaking of which, I'm going to quit talking and we're going to get to the good stuff. Like I mentioned, our Chief Medical Officer, Christy Anderson, is going to introduce our speaker today, and I will go off mute. Christy, it's to you.
Thank you, Rhonda. Yes, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Yael Cycowicz. She's an associate professor of clinical neurobiology in psychiatry at Columbia University and a research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. She is also the director of the Neuro-Cognition and Emotional Laboratory at Columbia University, which investigates attention, memory, and emotional regulation mechanisms and processes. She received her Master of Science in Neurobiology from Hebrew University, Hadassah Medical School in Jerusalem, and her PhD in Experimental Psychology from NYU. Dr. Cycowicz's research investigates the complex relationships between brain activity and behavioral measures during development and aging, and includes translational research using different neuroimaging tools. Currently, her focus is on understanding the impact of trauma on mental health across the lifespan, its spread across generations, and its influence among family members. The World Trade Center Health Program is committed to better understanding the results of the 9/11 terror attacks in terms of both the immediate health impacts, but also the longer-term ramifications. There is a broader recent expansion of disaster research topics and focus areas, which include exploration of how historical and cultural traumas such as war, slavery, and genocide affect survivors' children for generations. While there's still much to learn, interventions are being developed to support these communities, and a better understanding of these processes in World Trade Center exposed populations may provide ways to mitigate the ongoing global legacy of disaster-related trauma. And with that, I will stop speaking and turn it over to our fabulous presenter. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for really this beautiful introduction, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to share with everybody our study. So I'm going to talk today about intergenerational transmission of trauma in WTC responders with PTSD. So WTC stands for World Trade Center Responder, and I'm going to use that term. And I'm going to use for intergenerational transmission of trauma, I'm going to use ITT. When a person is exposed to trauma, there are many different kind of consequences. And I'm talking about psychological trauma, Obviously, when somebody suffers physical injury, it's a little different. But even just having a psychological trauma by witnessing a terrible event, there are consequences. There are psychological consequences. The most common one that people tend to talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder relating to trauma, but there are actually other psychopathologies like depression, anxiety, panic, and very common a comorbidity with substance use disorder. There are also some physical consequences, and people can suffer from sleep disturbances and feeling tired, fatigue, and having even digestive problems. Others might have behavioral manifestation where they avoid going to places or to do things that may remind them of the trauma, and that can cause to social isolation. And in some, they lose interest in things that they were interested in prior to the traumatic event. And finally, given that they have psychopathology, often it will affect their cognitive functioning, and it can be seen in their change in their attention span, in memory loss or memory distortion, especially when it relates to or could remind them of their own trauma. And also they can develop biases to different types of stimuli, including in emotion recognition. So it's not very difficult to imagine that if there is a member of a family, and especially a parent, who experienced trauma, having such a whole host of challenges and difficulties, it will affect other family members, and especially growing children. So our research was to look into intergenerational transmission of trauma, which can be manifested by transferring somehow the experience of the trauma or the result of the trauma from parents to the children, even though the children themselves were not witnesses, they were not part of that event, but just being in the growing up and being with their parents who experience it, they get something of that traumatic experience that can affect their own well-being. There are different types of trauma. There's a trauma that occurs just in one moment in time. It's acute, and we can think about things like that. When there is a terror attack or shooting, it happened and it's over. Or we can talk about chronic, where somebody experienced trauma for a long period of time, and that could be, let's say, during a war, a long war, like the one in Ukraine now. There are people who experience already a year of trauma. So the source of the trauma is also important. Mass violence, like terror attack or shooting that occur too often in the country, versus natural disaster that we have much less control over. We have some, but not completely. And there is another type of trauma that has some overlapping in terms of consequence, but it's not the same. And that's a trauma that comes from abuse and neglect. And the reason why I put it as a different category is because it often occurs at home, a place where somebody needs to feel the most secure compared to the rest of the world. And so abuse and neglect within a home are having particular kind of challenges that are a little bit different than the trauma that we are going to talk about today, which is the 9/11 trauma. So on September 11, the day started beautifully and developed into a terrible, terrible a disaster. And in terms of a disaster, it was acute for many of the people who were there where they needed to run away. But for the first responders, or in general, WTC responders, that event that was acute could have become chronic if they were to be there for the time it took to clean up all the debris and the mess, and to kind of keep seeing the consequences of this terrible, terrible attack. And not only that, but for many of them, being in the pit for so many months, they experience, breathing the toxin and being around the toxin, touching it, and maybe even seeing some unpleasant pictures of human remains. So for some of the responders, that exposure was actually chronic. Previous research that looked at ITT demonstrate that there is increase in vulnerability to develop PTSD among the offspring. There is a huge amount of research that was done on second generation of Holocaust survivors. But there is also research on the Oklahoma bombing survivors and Cambodian refugees. And you can see in all of them, they found increased vulnerability to have PTSD. Even though the Oklahoma bombing was an acute event versus the Holocaust, which for many, many people was chronic over many, many months or even years. And more recently, looking at intergenerational transmission of trauma from 9/11 first responder to children, in a Hoven group, they demonstrate that the children were more likely to develop PTSD and anxiety. So here is already an evidence that not only PTSD is a risk, but also psychopathology, maybe even in general. Furthermore, with respect to the children of 9/11, when parents, WTC parents, when they came to the health program and were asked about their children, many of them reported that the children exhibit internalizing and externalizing disorder, as well as somatic problems. And their numbers were quite high compared to the general population. But most importantly, thinking about it now, it's already 20 years later, it is still very important to look at those children who are now adults, because it has been demonstrated the disorder persists beyond the childhood years. And not only that, but these individuals are actually more prone to develop psychopathology as a result of their own trauma that they may have. So for example, this particular paper I cite here, Nikolai, they have looked at POWs of the Yom Kippur War in Israel, and they found that among those who have parents who were Holocaust survivors, the rehabilitation, returning to normal life was much, much more difficult, and they have many more evidence of psychopathology compared to POW, where the parents were not Holocaust survivors. So it is really important to understand that the risk, even if it's not being manifested during their childhood, can come up later on. So the aim of our study was first to establish a new cohort of offspring of WTC responders who have PTSD. We were looking at those who have PTSD because clearly those people have a major issue, and it will be affecting their children, as I explained at the beginning. We will evaluate the level of psychiatric, behavioral, and cognitive emotional functioning of the children. And we want to also try to identify ITT pathways by examining factors that mediate association between the parents' 9/11 exposure and the offspring psychiatric, behavioral, and cognitive emotional functioning. Our general method for data collection was entirely remotely. We have two web-based online systems In one of them, in the red cap, we acquired self-report information regarding the participant well-being. And in the second one, we measured cognitive functioning, and it was the Gorilla Behavioral Platform. These two systems were connected in such a way that from the participant point of view, they just continue the task. They just continue the study from one to another. Our parent cohort, as I mentioned, were WTC responders. They were composed of police and rescue and cleanup workers. And we chose only those that have at least 4 visits to the WTC HP program, and that at least in one of those visits, there was indication that they have PTSD. So the study design was as follows. We received from the data center contact information. We requested to have phone and email addresses. All of the people that we received had, as I mentioned, 4 visits, and in one of, at least in one of them, indication for PTSD. Those parents received an email with a link to register online for the study, and the registration include signed consent and HIPAA, and providing their children contact information. The inclusion criteria was that they must have children. And initially, we wanted those children to be all under the age of 21 during 9/11. However, when the responders came to the health program, they did not come the day after 9/11, nor a month after. They came for the next few years the first time. And when they were asked if they have children at home, they could have said yes if the child was born after 9/11. So later on, you will see we kind of expand a little bit the age range of the children. We also wanted, when they have the 4 visit to the HP, to the health program, we want to make sure that the last one, the 4th one, was no earlier than 2016. And we did that because we want to make sure that we have the most updated contact information for the participants. Once the parent finished the registration and provided the children contact, an email was sent to the children with a link to complete the study, and the email sent to all the children of that parent. And once one child completed the study, then a parent received an email to complete the study as well. And both parents and children who completed receive a compensation as an e-gift card. When you do an online study, like in any study, there are certain methodological challenges. Here they are very particular to being online. The first one is technical. First of all, not everybody necessarily will have a device, and we have very few people like that. And initially, we plan to tell such people to go to the library. But this study was done during COVID, and libraries were closed. So there were few people who really could not do that. Also, device compatibility could be sometimes the problem. A bigger issue was that the email sometimes reached the participant spam or junk box, so they actually never really looked at it. And we call them up, I will tell you in a minute. And the other thing, many people today don't trust everything you get by email, and you get some kind of invitation and you're not sure what it is. Similarly, when we call them up because of the pandemic, we used Google numbers. We were not in offices, and people don't necessarily trust phones with some arbitrary numbers. As in every kind of recruitment, a lot of people refuse. We have also people who refuse. Here it was a little bit more complicated, because if the parents agree to participate, but the children refuse, so that's a refusal for the family. We also have some more interesting cases where the parents really wanted to participate, but they didn't want children to participate at all. They didn't want their children to get involved. And we also have some inaccurate contact information or missing information, which was difficult. And finally, when you have an online study, data quality is a little bit harder. First, everything is self-report. So any kind of assessment is based on what people are telling us. We cannot really sit down and talk to them and do a good evaluation. And also, we have no control if they don't do some of it, or if they didn't understand something, unless we really call to check, or they call us to ask questions. So if something happened, we don't necessarily know. So knowing that we have all of these issues, we try to overcome the best we could by having a large number of interns who made a lot of telephone calls. And through these telephone calls, we could make sure that people do check their spam to see the links. And if they do have technical problems, to help them with that. And we make an effort to get contact information. If we call them up, it turns out that the email address is inaccurate, or if they didn't have an email, to find an email, and things like that. Here are the study measures that we use. First, demographic, which include, of course, age, biological sex, race and ethnicity, education, marital status, employment, family income, and number of children. A number of children, we also ask for the children who are now adults. Many of them are married with their own children. And then we assess mental health by a PCL-5 for the PTSD, depression by the PHQ-8. We use the GAD-7 for anxiety and the PDSR for panic. And we assess alcohol use disorder with the audit, and drug use with the DAS-10. And we also ask them about number of life stressors. We also assess physical health by asking them to report physical health for the parents. We ask them before and after 9/11. And we also have a very extensive questionnaire for COVID-19. Again, remember, we did during the epidemic, where especially in New York City, people were practicing very extreme social isolation, and the disease really spread very, very widely. So we ask a lot of questions that might not be necessary today. And we also have several questionnaires looking at social support and about parents-children relationship. Finally, we had these 3 tasks that we use the Gorilla behavioral platform, where we assess cognition and emotion, and we use the facial discrimination task to assess emotion recognition, and task switch for executive functioning, and NBEC task for working memory. So for the demographic, we have 176 parents and 270 children. We have some family who only one child respond, or who only have one child to respond. And we have some family who had up to 4 children who responded. You could see the range of the ages for the parents from 45 to 76, and for the children 18 to 43. So as I mentioned earlier, some of them were born after 9/11, and we expanded it later on because we had a lot of parents who said to us that they have children who were outside the age range, and we decided to try to include them, but we did it towards the end. We also have some parents who actually have children who are much, much older, and they were needed to be excluded. When we look at biological sex, we see a big difference between these two groups, the parents and their adult children, because for the first responders, we really see the distribution of the sexes based on who are the responders at that time. Most of them, 85% of them, were male, so we can see it in our data too. But in the now adult children, we should have expected to see about half and half. We see more women, just because women are more likely in general in studies to be willing to participate in research. In terms of race and ethnicity, again, we have the distribution of what the responders were at 9/11, and the majority were non-Hispanic white, and it's reflecting also in their children. But the biggest difference is that in the children, we see many more who are reporting to be more than one, belong to more than one group. And that's probably demonstrating change in the society where there is more marriages between people belonging to different race or ethnic groups. We also see a very clear change in the education of the now adult children. The parents, the WTC responders, for the most part, have high school and some college, and a few of them had associate degree. But among the children, we have many more who have a bachelor degree and graduate degree. And remember, our population for the children is between 18 to around 40. So some of them are just finishing high school or starting college, and they probably will also enter that group. And some people who got the bachelor might still get a graduate degree. So we can see a shift in education. It also translates into the income level, where you could see that most of the parents are earning less than $100,000, where the children are already start showing larger income, and still many of them are still in school, as we can see in the next slide, where when we look at employment, we see there are children who said that they are full-time students. We have parents who are retired. We don't have children who are retired, but we have a lot of the children who are full-time employee, but some of them are still part-time, maybe because they are still students. So they can, with time, if we would have done it in 5 years, I believe we are going to see this group to be more educated and belonging to a different socioeconomic group. Of course, as expected, more parents are living with spouse or partner than the children, again, because of the age difference. So some of these young people are not yet associated with somebody, but also in terms of expectation in society, the parents are mostly married. There are a lot of never married young adults, but also there are more who are in stable relationship, and they might feel that they don't need to be married. And it's possible that in earlier generation, there was expectation that people will get married. So we can see that among them. Okay, now we will look at the mental health of both groups. So I want to point out that when we looked at the PTSD, it turns out that we lost some people who didn't respond to the PCL among the parents, but more so among the children. So I mentioned earlier some technical problem. We are not sure exactly why it happened. This was not the last task. This was in the middle, and they continue responding to the rest of it. So later on, we will have a separate analysis when we included the PTSD. Importantly, when we look at PTSD among the parents, we see that only about 40% had either probable or possible PTSD. And that was a little bit surprising because our selection criteria was to have WTC responder who, at least in one of the visits, show indication of PTSD. So one explanation for it is that this is 20 years later, and many of them may have reduced of the symptom of the PTSD, so the score become much smaller. Another thing is, as I'm going to show in a minute, there are many other psychopathologies. It could be that the PTSD kind of change a little bit, and now other symptoms become a little bit more apparent. Among the children, we also see a high percent of PTSD. If we look at depression, we can see in both groups there is a high level of depression compared to the general population, and so is anxiety, which is comparable across the group. Also, panic was very, very high in both groups, and this panic that I'm referring to is a panic that assumes psychiatric origin. The particular instrument we use asks several questions that allow us to distinguish a panic attack that may come as a result of drug use or medication or other illness. And after taking care of that, we still have a really large percentage of panic. In terms of alcohol use disorder, it exists in the parents, but it's comparable to the population, but it's quite high among the children, and there is not much issue with drug use. The biggest difference here to see in the children is the children show a PTSD to COVID. So we had a particular PCL with 4 questions specifically about COVID. And our finding is interesting, given that COVID was actually more scary and more dangerous among the older population. And you could see some of the parents, it was difficult for them. But for the children, for them, it was a little bit less. And we see a much higher score in the PCL. And that's probably reflect the fact that they have been demonstrated in general that the younger people exhibit much more mental health issues during COVID, probably because social isolation was much harder on them when they were young, and also the impact on young family with young children was very difficult without the schooling, and so it could be that that's part of the reason why we see such a big difference between these two groups. As I mentioned earlier, we have extensive questions regarding COVID-19, and the questions were asking about illnesses, either of self or people who you live with in the family, or family that you don't live with, and finally among friends. And here I divided it into illness that you could just deal with it at home, or very serious illness, or even hospitalization. So we can see at home both parents and children were ill, but parents were more seriously ill than children, and that is expected. And in both cases, there were family members who were ill at home, and in both cases, there were family members who were ill who were not with them at home. We're talking about, siblings, or for the children, could be aunts and uncles. And again, you could see here for family members who were not at home, it was a little bit, and there was more seriously ill, a little bit more among the reported of the older group, demonstrating that that's their peer. And more importantly, among friends, children have a lot of friends who are ill, and that's not surprising. The young people feel that they can get sick and it will be okay. But the biggest difference is seeing that parents report of more friends who passed away than children. And that makes sense because their peer group is older and they were more vulnerable to the COVID. But it's also contrasting with the fact that I just said that the parents did not have high PTSD as a result of COVID, where the children who did not experience as much death among friends did. So that really kind of explains more probably the social isolation contribute to their mental health more than the experience of really death. Okay, so I'm going to report only on one of the cognitive tasks that we use, about the emotional recognition task. And this task requires from the participant to look very briefly at a face, which could be either happy, positive, or could be an angry face or threatening face, which will be negative. And we have multiple faces. We have 60 faces, and of different people, both men and women, all different race and ethnicity. And the pictures appear on the screen only for 250 milliseconds. So it's a very fast. They have to recognize it very quickly, and they have to make a decision within 2 seconds if the face is reflecting a positive or negative emotion. We emphasize both speed and accuracy. So we told them, please respond as quickly and as accurately as you can. When we look at the accuracy, we see that they were overall quite accurate in this task, both parents and children, but children were more accurate than their parents. And only the parents show less accuracy in detecting negative faces. And for the children, they detected both equally well. However, when we look at the reaction time, we see that for the parents, they responded more slowly, of course, than the children. That's just an age effect. But they respond faster for the negative. So maybe they made more mistakes because they responded faster. On the other hand, the children who were as accurate for negative as for the positive, they took a little bit more time to respond to the negative pictures. So maybe they become more accurate because they gave themselves this extra time to process it and they got it correct. So now we are going to look a little bit into the ITT to try to find what are the factors, the characteristics of the parents and the youth that is associated with the youth, with the now adult children, psychiatric outcome. So for this, we used a multivariable logistic regression, and we did a separate model for each of the psychiatric outcome. And we took into consideration a correlation between children within the same family, and all variables were adjusted within the model. So here the most, I'm going to show an odd ratio and p-value for each of the children outcome: depression, anxiety, alcohol use disorder, and panic. And the red ones demonstrating increased likelihood to have the disorder. So if a parent is depressed, there is high likelihood that their child will be depressed. And if the parent, the responder, was a female, then it's more likely that their children will have depression or anxiety, or both. And if the child is a female, then the child is more likely to have panic, but is less likely to have, and this is in green, it's less likely to have alcohol use disorder. And the number of life stressor events that a child is experiencing make them more vulnerable to have AUD or panic. And the PCL for PTSD was associated with anxiety and with panic. Here we found something very interesting about the social support. So we used a social support question. We had 3 questions asking if they have somebody who love them, who care about them, and if they have somebody who will take care of them if they are sick and are bedridden. And we asked them if they have somebody to go to talk to when they are in crisis. So when they responded, and the scale was from 0 to 5. So the higher the number, the more likely that they have somebody to turn to give them, to love them, to care for them, and to give them advice. So when people have such a good support, they were less likely to be depressed, they were less likely to be anxious, and less likely to develop AUD. I think this is really particularly important. We're talking about what as a society or people can do for people who experience trauma. And one way to ensure their resiliency is by ensuring that they have a social support. And social support could be, for the 9/11, maybe creating some support group even. Doesn't have to be necessarily to find for them friends, as we cannot do, but creating a support environment so they can really talk about it and feel that somebody cares and somebody understands. That could provide a good a way to help them to develop resiliency. And we did not find any effect for race and ethnicity or for living with spouse or partner. Now, I mentioned earlier that we did that also for a PTSD. We just did it kind of a separate model because we have fewer number of participants. And here we can see again that parental panic disorder was associated with children PTSD. And if the child was a female, they were more likely to have PTSD, and they were more likely to have PTSD to COVID. So these two might be related. So if we want to summarize mental health, so we see the rate of probable mental disorders are high among both parents and now adult children, and parental depression is associated with children depression, and parental panic is associated with children PTSD. Being a mother responder is associated with child depression and anxiety disorder, and being a daughter is associated with higher risk of PTSD and panic, but lower risk for AUD. For the children themselves, their own trauma play an important role in their own mental health, and we can see this increased NUD and panic. And that goes together with the notion that I showed at the beginning, that people who grew up around trauma or trauma experienced parents are more likely to develop psychopathology later on for their own trauma. And also children's score for COVID-19 PCL are associated with PTSD, anxiety, and panic disorder. And finally, the use of support is particularly important in ensuring less psychopathology. Now, we also want to go back into the cognitive emotion task and to see if that task also relates to some of the psychopathology that we saw in the parents and the children. So we use multivariable linear regression model to examine such an association. And we did a separate model for each group. And the outcome here is a difference between correct response to positive and correct response to negative facial expression pictures. So here we have two different tables, one table including everybody and not including the PTSD, and here, and when we include the PTSD at the bottom, and we have fewer subjects. The important thing is the red, those numbers that are marked in red are the ones that show a greater accuracy for negative pictures. And when it's in green, it shows greater accuracy for positive pictures. So what is consistent is that female were more accurate. Female children were more accurate in negative pictures in both analysis, and that parents who have high number of stressful events were more accurate in detecting negative pictures. Children also were more accurate in detecting negative pictures if they have AUD. But here we got that parents who were more anxious were better at detecting happy pictures. And I am not sure why that. This doesn't totally make sense, so we need to look a little bit closer into the data to see what that came about. Because in general, we expect that when you are having some mental health issue, you're more likely to detect negative stimuli, especially for anxiety, because threat is very salient for people who have anxiety. So summary for that analysis is performance in the emotional recognition task show an age effect, parental anxiety associated with higher accuracy in detecting positive faces, and parental LEC account is associated with higher accuracy in detecting negative faces. But among the now adult children, being a female or having AUD is associated with higher accuracy in detecting negative faces. So to conclude, we have established, as we wanted, a new cohort of WTC responder offspring, and we can see age-appropriate demographic differences, and we see also demographic shift in education and income of the children compared to their parents. We also see in both parents and children high prevalence of mental health disorders. In terms of evidence of ITT, we demonstrated by showing a transmission of specific disorder, depression, from parents to their now adult children. We also demonstrate increased rate of mental disorder among now adult children, and we see a great effect of maternal mental health on now adult children. Our future direction include to investigate the role of the WTCR occupation, police versus rescue and cleanup workers are not the same. Police, we assume, tend to be prepared for difficult events, but people who work as a construction site to clean up not necessarily are being prepared to deal with atrocities. We also look into 9/11 parental exposure, if there were the duration, as I mentioned, chronic versus acute. And we will look also in the physical illness and the caregiving role of the parents. We mentioned already the difference between mother and father, but it could be also the relationship between the parent to the child. It could play an important role, and we have some questionnaire looking into that. And we are also planning to use wealth of previous data that we about to get from the GRDC that can give us a way to chart a trajectory of the well-being of those families. Part of the consent form that the participants signed is that we will be able to receive this prior data for those who consented. I would like to thank, first and foremost, the first responders and their children that gave us their time and gave us the information to be able to carry this study. And I would like to also thank the study team, and in particular to Dr. Diana Rodriguez Moreno and Dr. Kili Cheslak-Postava, who are MPI with me on this study, and to the rest of the team, of course. And a special thanks to the recruiter who made hundreds of, if not thousands of phone calls to reach out to the parents and to the children and to help them to resolve any kind of issue they have, to send them links, and again, and to listen to incredible stories. These telephone calls are not so simple, and some of the calls were not necessarily pleasant. Let me just drink for a minute, I'm sorry. Some parents, you know, when somebody calls them up, just hang up on them on the intern. That doesn't feel very nice. But there were also people who shared a lot of stories and a lot of things that happened to them since then. So they did incredible work. And I want to finish with a particularly moving story or moving statement of a family that after they participate with their children, they wrote to us to thank us for this study, because they never thought about what the children experienced during that time. And by having this study, they got together and they talk about those days. And they thank us for the opportunity to have such an interesting discussion, to recognize that the children were affected by what was going on in the home. So that was really wonderful. I also want to thank, of course, to the World Trade Center Health Program and the GRDC, and to NIOSH CDC who fund this research, and to Research Foundation, New York State Psychiatric Institute in Columbia, where this study was taken. Thank you so much.
Dr. Cycowicz, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Great information that you shared. And I know that we have questions for you right now. Some even came into the chat box into my private message here. So if you're ready, we've got some questions for you. I can start with this first one. All right. And thank you so much for presenting. That was fantastic. That was really good information to share and very helpful for us. I'm going to start off with this first one, and then others can, if you want to raise your hand on the Zoom, we can do it that way, or you can send me messages in the chat box. So this first question I received was, can you comment on the background, general population, prevalence of anxiety, depression, PTSD, and panic disorder to give a context to assertion of a high prevalence of those disorders among these children. And I can put that into the chat box because I know that was quite a bit. So I can put that question right into the chat box if that's helpful.
So, so for most of the disorder that when I looked on, tried to find from the CDC and NIMH to see prevalence, typically I would say for most disorders, it's hovering around 10% or less. And we have more often above 20%. So for the most part, it looks much bigger, but it's a little hard to say because I try to think that we also collected the data during COVID, and we know that during COVID, everything got bigger. So I'm a little bit careful. I didn't want to put and to say that it's twice as much as the general population, because most of the data that I have was before COVID, and COVID did change a lot, and we were part of it. It still felt that there were a lot of people who seemed to have anxiety and panic. It was really a lot of them. Panic in particular, I thought was very large. Panic usually is around 5 to 6%.
Thank you. Thank you.